Okay, y'all are probably wondering, what do the general semantics and Sophists have in common? Anybody else? Nobody? Okay, just me. Cool. All right. So first, I want to thank Kristen Haldeman, a good friend and colleague of mine, for her remarks and critiques of this essay before I talk about it. So last time I was up here last year, I keep asking these questions. I'm in a PhD in rhetoric program, and we're studying rhetoric, and I'm curious because I love general semantics, and I've always been curious, like, why have they seemingly been at odds with each other? And much of the 20th century rhetoricians painted the picture that, general semantics people are bad, rhetoricians are good, and this kind of thing. So part of this essay stems from that, wondering why, but also I wanted to reconcile those things and hey, I want to do rhetoric and general semantics. So I started looking around for this, at what's going on. And on one hand, I believe in the social utility of rhetoric. On the other, I believe in the value that general semantics brings for critical thinking and evaluating, the factness of the world and all this other stuff. So how to reconcile these seemingly antagonistic beliefs? Well, perhaps we've been looking at the wrong rhetoricians as exemplars. So general semanticists are not the only group that have agitated these modern rhetoricians, and I'll describe a few of those in a bit. The Greek Sophists have been doing so for a long, long time. The idea put forward by the Sophists is that the world has less to do with utopian ideals and more to do with our lived experience, more to do with us, people, right? The Sophists and the Semanticists both have been compared before, but always are generally in a negative light. So I hope to evaluate them and compare them in a positive light and constructively. But I'm not the first to do so. Valerie Peterson's not here. I was going to tell her, thank her for her work on a paper she had talking about the harlot of the arts, which is rhetoric, and Korzybski's system. Maria Polsky, who's not here, she lamented several issues ago in etc. the unfortunate lack of the intersection between communication disciplines or subdisciplines such as general semantics, rhetoric, linguistics, and semiotics, wherein she says that they all study overlapping areas and can enrich and cross-pollinate one another. And she suggested that a future interesting subject for a paper would be the possible collaboration between pedagogical tools of general semantics and rhetoric. I don't know that I will fulfill that with this paper, but I hope to at least continue that conversation. My aim is not to advocate for an anti-rhetoric, all right, or anti-rhetoric position, but for a rhetoric that recognizes its proper relationship to reality. Admittedly, I will do something quite against the general semantics playbook. I'm going to rely on broad strokes and generalizations, and I acknowledge that up front, mainly because, the Sophists, we're building on some work that is generalized from their stuff. So bear with me as we try to do this, and I'm hoping to publish this eventually so you can read the longer extended version. The problem of situating general semantics principles alongside rhetoric, at least in the past, has been a problem of orientation. Historically, many of the rhetoricians who I'll discuss criticized and dismissed general semantics dismissed general semantics based on a Platonic and Aristotelian conception of rhetoric. Yet, how does a general semantics worldview align with a sophistic view of rhetoric? So I submit that sophistic rhetoric may closely resemble the democratic social imperatives found in so much of the general semantics literature, as opposed to the Platonic and Aristotelian versions of that. Sophistic rhetoric also bears a pragmatic stance, a stance that is often seen in precursors of general semantics, such as Peirce, Ogden, and Richards, and also in Korzybski's formulations of adjusting our languaging habits to fit the world around us. Much of the pragmatic stance of the Sophists stems from dispensing with metaphysical and ideal notions of reality, a move that Plato, Aristotle, and many later philosophers saw as problematic. Following these beginning concepts, I suggest taking a view of rhetoric from the lens of the Sophists, wherein, to quote John Polakis, to understand the possible in the spirit of the Sophists, we must operate free from Aristotle's influence and from a pre- or non-metaphysical perspective. You see this in Anatole Rappaport. He had some works on that as well. But I'm not certain of Korzybski's thoughts or his background on Aristotelian or Platonic rhetoric, but I think he might agree to most extents that a non-Aristotelian rhetoric may be more applicable to his views of reality. This is where the trouble semantics comes in, and I'm going to talk about the semanticists and the sophists. First, the semanticists. General semantics was troublesome to many rhetoricians, particularly in the 1950s. The debate between Richard Weaver on one side and S.I. Hayakawa on the other. So in many of his books, Richard Weaver, in books such as Ideas Have Consequences and Language is Sermonic, Weaver excoriated general semantics for being too relativist and too lax with what he perceived as sacred. Weaver was a staunch Platonist, in contrast to the semanticists, whom he considered to be modern-day sophists, due to their view that meaning is not some transcendental essence, but is located in us, perhaps embodying Protagoras, a famous sophist, man is the measure of all things, right? So Walker Gibson, he agreed with this, and noting that Korzybski and his precursors, such as Charles Sanders Peirce and I.A. Richards, quote, would not have seemed so strange or seemed strange to the sophists in the 5th century. The sophists of that era knew the power of rhetoric that they used and taught following Heraclitus. They believed in a world that was always in flux. On both accounts, the hygienic approach of general semantics encourages us to evaluate our language and our rhetoric, and to acknowledge that the world is always changing, in large part because the language with which we describe and navigate it is also always changing. According to Richard Johannesson, Hayakawa's attacks on the neo-scholastics, including Weaver, is rooted in the empiricist view of knowledge central to general semantics. The structure of language should correspond to the experimental structure found in nature. The questions commonly asked by general semanticists are, what is going on? And does the language fit the facts? Weaver and the neo-scholastics he's associated with sought an ideal, a transcendental authority that everyone should align to and appeal to. The issue with such an assertion is that as many empiricists, language theorists such as Korzybski par excellence, the problem is that we can only talk about the world based on our sensory perceptions, our semantic reactions, and our overall makeshift understanding. Language will always be necessary but not sufficient. Language is a map, but one always in need of updating to keep pace with its territory. This is why Weaver thought general semantics was a, quote, psychopathology, stuck in the realm of becoming. Other critics claimed that general semanticists were nominalists and relativists. General semantics stalwart Alan Walker Reed commented on this trend, writing, because general semantics puts great emphasis on linguistic issues, some philosophers claim that it's just a resurgence of nominalism, end quote. He also wrote about the topic in an article titled General Semantics as Radical. Robert Nordberg wrote about this topic in an article titled General Semantics as Radical Nominalism, in which he argued that general semantics is contradictory because it relies on generalizations and the tools that it supposedly disdains. So Reed calls out critics, Alan Walker Reed calls out these critics, such as Nordberg, for their mischaracterization of general semantics. He says that many people have formed their judgment of Korzybski by reading the secondary sources without a word of Korzybski himself. If they had, and this is my words, and if they had read Korzybski, extensive as his writings are, perhaps these critics would understand the principles of non-allness and etc. It seems that the people who claim general semantics to be nominalists, anti-democratic, and even pathological are often the ones who hold their stances to a fault while not realizing there's always more to learn, more to experience, and more to say. But the critics did not stop with these charges. Many of the detractors, according to Korzybski and Hayakawa, or they accused Korzybski and Hayakawa of being anti-rhetoric. While not entirely negative about general semantics, critic Bauer Ali argued that Korzybski offers his system in opposition to Aristotelian rhetoric, but this is not entirely accurate. Korzybski's project and non-Aristotelian system largely focused on Aristotle's organon, not his rhetoric. Even those who are somewhat sympathetic, such as to general semantics, such as John B. Newman, or basically they talked about some of the problems. He playfully suggested that there are a few things that seem to be more fun than taking pot shots at general semantics. It's a time-honored sport. All right, so moving from the semanticists to the sophists. Following Eric Havelock, I do not wish to make this a screed against Plato. However, Plato's concept for the sophists and rhetoricians is evident in many of his writings, such as the Phaedrus, the Euthydemus, and most prominent in the Gorgias. Many years ago, Everett Lee Hunt noted that taken as a whole, the synthesis of Plato's utterances on rhetoric and rhetoricians proves throughout his whole life he regarded with contempt and disdain all contemporary rhetoricians and theories of rhetoric. And so while our perceptions of are certainly open to interpretation, Plato can hardly be seen as sympathetic to rhetoric in his day or ours. Much of the criticism toward general semantics in the previous century has come from the, quote, and this is quoting Havelock, conservative-minded historians rallying to Plato's defense. Plato was not a liberal thinker, instead embracing an authoritarian stance. His avocation of the philosopher king in the Republic and his notion of the gold souls bear little resemblance to the democratic view of society. Aristotle followed Plato's footsteps, although ever so cautiously. It seems to me that this contrast of liberal democratic views and conservative authoritarian view offers an interesting segue into the collective mind of the sophists and their troublesome antics toward the philosophical views of rhetoric. Change and difference are ever present in the sophistic view. In contrast, Plato looked toward the utopian ideals somewhere beyond existence rather than the sometimes ugly, always carnal, temporal beings that we are. The sophistic view also embraced language differently from the philosophical. The sophists' views of language are as paramount, but also necessarily insufficient. Summarizing the sophists, Havelock concludes that if it is the total social picture you want to talk about, language is only an approximate medium for describing it. And then Havelock was an early illustrator of the sophistic view, but many others have followed suit. So in the last 40 years or so, there's been a sophistic revival. Susan Jarrett's work is informative here. She says that until the 19th century, the first sophists had been buried under 2 millennia of neglect, an outcome of the passionate condemnation they provoked from 2 of their contemporaries who have fared better in the histories, Plato and Aristotle. The later sophists of the Hellenistic era, the second sophistic, fell into disrepute largely because of their comparison to lawyers. And y'all know the story about 1,000 lawyers at the bottom of the sea? It's a good start. All right. So, however much the ill will toward the earlier sophists stems from Plato and Aristotle as they portrayed them. Regarding the sophists, Plato casts them as a self-important, materialistic, and even violent in contrast to the self-effacing, virtuous Socrates. I'm quoting Jarrett here. Aristotle seconded this moral censure when he opened the rhetoric as a challenge to the sophists. Aristotle defines the word sophist in terms of a certain kind of moral purpose. This quote-unquote moral purpose was an ever-present conviction about and attention toward the kind of society the sophists existed in, which was a democratic society at that time. Similarly to the criticisms of the general semanticists as antagonists and outsiders of the rhetorical tradition, the philosophers often saw the sophists as such. Jarrett suggests that much of the well-known lore of their historical existence, which contributes to the impression of otherness, the sophists were seen as stranger guests to Athens. In many ways, Korzybski himself was seen as a stranger due to his count status, his commanding persona, and not to mention him being Polish. Not only were the sophists considered outsiders, but they were also relegated to the dark corner of historical conversation for many centuries. The implications of this move meant that rhetoric was not shaped by its pioneers of its practice, but by its critics. As Havelock and Jarrett have demonstrated, the sophists have maintained a troublesome antagonism for the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition, much like what we do with our non-Aristotelian tradition in general semantics. This bears a resemblance, kind of familiar resemblance to what we do. In closing, following many of these similarities between Sophists and Semanticists, the least of which is their rivalry with the Platonic and Aristotelian counterparts, one can see how a sophistic orientation toward rhetoric opens up possibilities for general semantics to aid and improve our understanding of traditional rhetoric and its applications. I'll close with a question. What might an orientation to teaching rhetoric and speech utilizing sophistic rhetoric and general semantics look like? And I hope to answer that in the final version of this paper. Thank you.